President Biden participated in a CNN town hall in Baltimore last Thursday, where he answered questions on a range of issues from voting rights legislation to supply chain management. Let's listen to some of that.
I was able to go to the private portion with 40% of all products coming into the United States of America on the West Coast go through Los Angeles and what am I doing here?
Is it Long Beach?
Long Beach, thank you.
While Biden at times struggled to articulate key factors of the supply chain situation currently facing the country, a new poll from Convention of States Action and the Trafalgar Group found a majority of voters said they have been personally hindered by the shortages in the United States. We're going to be looking at our own Hill-Harris-X data on Biden's approval on supply chain management later in the week. But until then, Ryan, what do you think about this?
Wasn't the Trafalgar one the one that everybody was saying was complete garbage throughout 2016?
But then
actually got it right. But then they looked into it and it got it right by accident or something like that. Either way, it's an intuitive finding from them. People have. I can't find it. People, but yeah, I heard. People have been. Yeah. People have been impacted by it, like they understand it, and they see that everybody sees the same signs in storefronts everywhere. People understand that the creaky economy snapped during the pandemic and has not been able to be pieced back together yet. I think people get that.
Yeah, and I think they're frustrated that there's not a clear answer, there's not a clear expectation of when it will be fixed. And I don't think anyone believes that the government knows when it will be fixed, or that this is going to clear itself out by the end of the year. I don't think anybody believes that, because there's many facets to this problem. It's an enduring problem. People political figures, to their peril, underrate the importance of the economic conditions generally in America, the relevance of that to their own reelection efforts.
Yeah, and probably stripping the entire manufacturing base of the entire country over the last 30 years, probably in hindsight, who could have seen it coming? It turns out that if you don't make anything and you need stuff, that just having money doesn't necessarily bring it to your doorstep.
Yeah. An analysis from 538 found Biden had lost support among all demographic groups, especially among key groups such as independents and Hispanics. Biden's approval has dropped from 50% among independents in the late spring and early summer to below 35% now, but he's lost the most ground with Hispanics. The latest poll from The Economist YouGov found just 45% of Hispanics approved of Biden's handling of the pandemic, compared with 65% in early June. And Politico Morning Consult's new survey found Hispanic approval of Biden's handling of the economy has dropped to 42%, compared with 60% back in June. While the report points out that it is normal for a president's approval rating to drop after the so-called honeymoon phase in the first term, there seems to be no indication of Biden's numbers to bounce back, at least not yet. So the are Hispanics just turning as a group into Republicans? I mean, that was what Trump was starting to see, right? That was his most favorable outcome, was performing better than expected with, especially with certain subgroups among Hispanics, Cuban Americans in Florida, part of his successful defense of Florida. Is this a group that's going to be the future Republican constituency?
Well, we're starting to see. People have been talking about this for years. We're starting to see polarization around education, and they, for some reason, in the United States, we focus on education rather than class, even though class is, education is kind of a marker for class. Right. And so under Trump, you saw, working class people of all races, working class people who did not have a college degree, trending towards Republicans. I do think if that isn't arrested somehow by some other development, you're going to continue to see things moving in that direction. It's a historical anomaly that the same party supports both civil rights and pro-immigration. Like prior to 1960, those were always separated for 150 plus years. The party that was more supportive of civil rights, for black people who were already in the country, what that meant, obviously, in the early 1800s.
Protecting their jobs from immigrants.
Well, so John Adams would be, more skeptical towards slavery. than, say, a Thomas Jefferson, who was, actively, energetically supportive of it. So it wasn't as if you had a very strong kind of abolitionist movement, and even, Abraham Lincoln expressed views associated with white supremacy, and it was initially very hesitant about the idea of full citizenship rights and full equality for people freed from slavery. But it was also clear which one of the two parties was more for civil rights and which one of the parties was for actively continuing slavery.
Right.
Meanwhile, the party that was for actively continuing slavery was pro-immigration. And so you had that as the political situation that existed in our country up through the 1960s, when you start to see the switch kind of in the 1990s, where you have Republicans being kind of both hostile to immigration and hostile to civil rights. And so but that's not normal. And so you could see a party that you could see a re-divergence in the future on this question. There's no kind of historical material determination that requires Democrats to always be the party that is both pro-immigration, pro-immigrant, and also pro-civil rights. And so you might see a breaking apart of that, and maybe you're seeing a little bit of that here.
Especially to the extent that Hispanic immigrants are able to work themselves up to higher class status. Like you said, education and class, they do correlate, but there are some differences. One of the big differences, so higher class, higher income people who do not have a college degree are the most reliable Republican constituency on earth.
Yes, right. And to be clear, just because you're Hispanic doesn't mean that immigration is your top issue. In fact, it probably isn't, and that's a mistake that a lot of Democrats make. That there are a lot of Hispanic voters who actually agree with Trump on immigration, and that's very disturbing for Democrats to think about.
And are religious or have very negative associations with political socialism, and the Trump message can absolutely capable of capturing them.
And studies of the concept of whiteness get mocked a lot, and I think oftentimes appropriately so. But there is a solid analysis that says that particularly among Hispanic immigrants, once you get to second, third, fourth generation, to think of them as in the black and brown category misunderstands how they self-identify. They begin to self-identify as white. And in fact, white Hispanic is a category that is often kind of brushed aside in our black and brown conversation. And so that is a flaw in this emerging Democratic majority thesis that just looked at the number of black and Hispanic people in the country, extrapolated out what their population was going to be without understanding that a significant chunk of that population, and that includes a significant chunk of the black population as well. You're seeing that number, but the numbers are smaller. Will become and will start voting much more like their white Native American. That's not the word. The white people who've been here for 3 generations, they'll start voting like them.
Right. Yeah, it's fascinating to see. We'll have more Rising right after this. Stick with us.